Chapter 18. Chastain Manor. Lorna was nothing if not resourceful. She assembled 24 hardy men with horses, armed and ready to ride by the next morning.
"There is no end to your industriousness, my lady,"
Darrett said, mounting Barnaby.
"I don't know how you find the time."
"I'm old," Lorna said, patting Barnaby's neck. "I can't sleep at night, so I scheme." "And she naps in the afternoon," Sorrel said, handing up a satchel to Talia. Katlyn was pleased to see a sort of kinship had formed between the two girls from such different backgrounds, yet so similar, each exhibiting a quiet confidence. They both stayed up during the night, sharing what they knew of herbal concoctions and potions from their respective people, even as Katlyn had been nodding off. They set out, an organized troop of sorts, with Darrett at their lead and Adamantus at his side. Gale followed in the role of Darrett's squire, and Katlyn and Talia in their wake. The rest of the men rode in pairs along the trade road, their weapons at the ready. But as they rode, they found they did not need much vigilance. The Eastlands were empty of people and Vorgs. Not a single sign of the monsters was to be found, not a print, a scent, a kill, or spore. Katlyn was relieved, and with so many men along with them, she slept soundly at night, nurturing the hope that perhaps the horde had returned to the forest, or at least been defeated. "Don't let your guard down," Gale said to her as warning one night, as they tucked their blankets around themselves. "There is a lot of land to cover as of yet." There was, and as they moved west towards the city and past more abandoned farmsteads and deserted villages, Katlyn could not help but think of all those she had come to know, Pathis and Annette, Garn and his kinfolk, not to mention her own family. The emptiness of the countryside grew ominous, a foreboding that deepened with every league they marched. With no sign of friend or foe, their unanswered questions grew to many. Soot had gone south, delivering a message to Kareth, sharing news and seeking aid. Sapphire had remained, ready to send back more news. Yet more days passed, and they had none. Daylight was encroaching on the long winter nights, the sky lightening earlier, the stars emerging later, yet the days were still often gray, with a lid of clouds pressed low on the bowl of the sky. The winter silence was absolute, with only the sound of the wind rushing through bare branches, occasionally punctuated by the sound of a barn door swinging open on an abandoned farmstead. Raindrops came and went, dampening their cloaks and muddying the ground. Even their horses grew subdued, their heads low, their hooves heavy with the mud of the road. They were outside Kinth when they found their first sign of the battles that had been waged. A horrid odor greeted them at the edge of town, and in a field not far from the road, they found the ashes of a great pyre. The bodies burnt were no ordinary creatures, as the malformed skulls with rows of needle teeth attested. The dead Vorgs were all too familiar to Katlyn. The charred bones, the blackened armor, all were strange and hideous. The men wore grave expressions while Darrett circled the pyre on Barnaby.
"Better dead than alive," he said. "Do they burn their own?"
"No," Adamantus said, circling the pile in the opposite direction. "This is the work of men."
"Then we have allies."
Darrett scanned the horizon as if to spot them. "But what has become of them?" Gale asked. No answers were apparent, but Darrett thought it necessary to at least visit the manor of the appointed seat of the government council.
"If there is a stronghold, it will be there. We might find survivors."
"I know the way," Katlyn said. She rode to the head of their column and led them down streets she had walked with Cody the previous autumn when she had first recruited Val and his friends as allies. How different the town was this day. The streets were abandoned, empty of people and covered instead with wind-blown leaves from the previous season. Some houses were boarded up, others had been left in haste, the front doors ajar. Katlyn remembered Pathis' account of Cadre, this village built too close to Sidon Wood, where in one night all the inhabitants disappeared, taken by Vorgs. History repeats itself. The town square was empty and silent, but for the bucket of the village well creaking in the breeze on its crank. Dark patches of blood stained the cobblestones. Whether it was human or Vorg, there was no telling, but the men of the party rode with their weapons drawn. Gail kept an arrow ready in her bow, Talia a spear in her hand. The main road leading to the Chastain Manor was also transformed. Gone was the tunnel of turning leaves. They had fallen to molder on the ground. Bare skeletal branches interlocked overhead, the sky the color of a tombstone beyond. Again they were met by the smell of the dead as they neared the manor. The gates stood open. A few tools, hoes, rakes, shovels, lay in the courtyard, along with an empty yoke and a few overturned buckets. The smell of rot drifted from the stables. One of the men rode in, only to return, his sleeve lifted to cover his nose.
"The animals, all dead."
"Slain?" Darrett asked.
"No, looks more like they starved to death."
The men formed a perimeter around the manor house, Katlyn stealing a glance at the holding cells, where Garn had cut Val and Cody loose. She dismounted and entered the manor with Darrett, Adamantis, Gail, and Talia. The tapestries that had formerly adorned the walls sat in moldy piles, the seal of the Chastain fox torn and laying in scraps on the floor. Furniture was broken and upended. By silent understanding, the others followed Katlyn, since she had been there once before, albeit as a prisoner. When they reached the anteroom, where she and Haille had once been dazzled by the bejeweled hilts and scabbards of swords, they found the walls stripped bare. Nothing of the treasures left there, except their shapes on the faded wall. No one was in the hall where she had once met Annabeth Chastain and learned of Annabelle's low place in the household as a bastard child. But as they stood and listened, the dead silence was broken by the sound of footfalls creaking across the boards overhead.
"Someone is upstairs,"
Darrett said.
"We'll take the main staircase up,"
Adamantis said. They filed after him, climbing the stairs in the front hall. At the top, they turned down a corridor in the direction of the sounds. Katlyn saw signs of habitation. Cheese rinds, chicken bones, and corn cobs were scattered on the floorboards. She could smell a chamber pot that had gone too long without emptying. Darrett came to the end of the hall, his sword drawn, and stopped in the door to the private chamber. He said nothing at first, but his eyes followed the movement of a figure, the shadow cast on the floor at his feet like a ghost. Katlyn came alongside with the others and saw Lady Chastain herself. She was in her bedclothes, her hair tangled and disheveled, her feet wrapped in rags. Her face was sallow and drawn, as if the skin were too big for her bones. She crossed the room to a high-backed chair where she sat down, her arms hanging over the sides, her hands bony, her nails overly long, and the rings too big for her fingers. "What intrusion is this? Trespassers in my home. State your names and stations." Any fear Katlyn had held for the woman was gone now. She stepped forward without hesitation and said, "I am Katlyn Barnes of Antis, friend of Prince Haille and ally to the crown. The last time I was here, you held the prince and me prisoner. How dare you address me with such a tone? I am Chancellor of Kinth." Katlyn scanned the room. The bed was unmade. Dirty dishes sat piled on a table in the corner. The air was thick with smoke from a weak fire, the remnants of book spines smoldering in the ashes.
"Your province lies in a ruin, my lady,"
Darrett said, with a sniff and a grimace.
"What happened here? Do you require aid?"
Lady Chastain let out a cackle of laughter. You offer me aid, now, at this late hour. Look around you. The end has already come.
Adeimantus moved through the doorway, turning his antlers sideways. Was it Vorgs who did this? If she was surprised by an elk speaking, she did not betray it. Katlyn wondered if she was completely mad. Annabeth Chastain's jaw trembled, and her eyes glistened.
Vorgs? Vorgs? You mean the creatures from the wood? Nightmares they are. But no, they are allied with him, and when they passed through, they still had use for me.
Who is this him you speak of? Darrett asked. Lady Chastain giggled through clenched teeth.
You still do not know who he is, do you? You are fools. Fools! You have played into our hands, into his hands all this time.
The Magus? Adeimantus asked. Tell us his name.
I don't know his name,
she shouted, her voice breaking. As suddenly as she had laughed, she now wept, twisting at her hair and pulling it in stringy clumps.
No one knows his name, but I tell you this, he does not go where he is not invited.
You made an ally of him, Adeimantus said. Lady Chastain let out a pain-ridden sob.
I did. I thought I could control him, command his men. I wanted to be part of their new order, but they never wanted order, only chaos. And when the walls came tumbling down, they called upon the monsters to scatter the people and unseat the council. I was just a traitor to them. Having betrayed my people once, they did not trust me themselves. But I resisted. He tried to control me, she said, and pointed across the room to a vanity.
The mirrors were shattered, the candlesticks toppled, the jars of powder and perfume cracked and spilling their contents. And in the center of the tabletop sat a moonstone, set in a choker and adorned with amber, a lidless, glowing eye.
I'm no fool. I knew what the stone would do to me, but he found other ways to control me. He took my daughters from me, and when they came to punish me, they brought a brand shaped into the word traitor. They heated it in the fire. I begged them to have mercy, begged them to spare me. Anything, I said. Anything. Anyone. Not me.
She went silent, her fingers working her hair, her eyes on the floor. Katlyn felt Talia take a step closer to her own side, so that their shoulders touched. It was reassuring.
They listened, Lady Chastain said. They listened to me. Anyone but me, I had said. So they followed through. My daughter, my only daughter, he did not slay Annabeth. They burned her with the brand, her face, her hands. I can still hear her screams.
Katlyn felt the blood drain from her face. The fate was worse than she would have wished on anyone, even Annabeth, who had so often teased and bullied her at the academy, who had also set them free that night they had been trapped at the manor. Queasy, Katlyn walked to the window, pushing it open for fresh air. A bracing breeze swept in around her as she leaned with both hands on the sill. The men that had escorted them were running about below, shouting to one another. Some were drawing their swords. "Riders at the gate!" one called up to her. Darrett and Gale rushed out of the room. Katlyn was ready to follow when she heard a familiar chirping. A fluttering flash of blue danced around her head and before her eyes. It was not azure, nor was it sapphire. "Scion!" The boy jay danced in the air, flapping his wings until she reached out a trembling hand for him to perch upon. He sang out a joyous tremolo. "You silly bird! We thought you were lost." At her words, he lifted into the air and swooped down to the gate, where a pack of riders were galloping through. At their lead was a familiar face.
"Are they friend or foe?"
Talia asked, her spear ready.
"Friend,"
she said, and cried out the window to her original champion.
"Cody Youngblood!"
Cody turned in his saddle, caught sight of her, and his face brightened with the smile so many women found irresistible. Even Talia let out a wordless hum of pleasure. "Lady Katlyn, I am at your service," he called up with a flourish and a bow.